My name is Jessica Bissett, and I'm the Director of Leadership Programs at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Although a different triangular relationship, that of Taiwan, China, and the United States, is on many people's minds these days, we will focus on a different triangle today, that of Latin America, China, and the United States. We are joined by three subject matter experts. Xiaoyu Pu, our moderator, is an associate professor of political science at the University of Nevada at Reno. His teaching and research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, East Asian politics, emerging world powers such as BRICS, international relations theory. Dr. Pu is also a Public Intellectuals Program Fellow at the National Committee. Next, we have Álvaro Méndez, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and the co-director of the Global South Unit at LSE Ideas. He also is an adjunct professor at Sciences Po Paris and Fudan University, as well as an associate fellow of the Geneva Center of Security Policy. And last but not least, we have Margaret Myers, who is the director of the Asia and Latin America program at the Inter-American Dialogue. She has published extensively on China's relations with the Latin America and Caribbean region, and is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University, George Washington University, and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Now onto the good stuff. Over to you, Xiaoyu.
Thank you, Jessica. I think it's a good time to talk about China, US, and Latin America relations. China's rise has generated a lot of speculations, debates, and also different reactions. Here in the United States, many people worry that if China has increased its influence in Latin America, that will jeopardize America's traditional sort of influence, diplomacy, and interest in the region. Is that a real reality? Some people even frame US-China competition as a pure zero-sum game. There are a lot of discussions, debates, speculations, but we need to understand what's really going on there. And we need to have some sort of expert sort of opinions on these issues. I think it's good we have two leading experts on China and Latin America relations. So we will talk about China's growing role there. We will talk about, importantly, how different Latin American countries, how they approach China. So then in the end, we will talk about the US role in the region and compare US and China and how the United States should think about China's growing impact in this region. So to start this conversation, I want to ask the first question is that how we describe China's growing presence in Latin America. So, and why should we care? I mean, why should anybody care? I mean, is that primarily economic relationship or also include diplomatic or even strategic or security dimensions? So maybe Margaret, start from you, maybe.
Sure, Xiaoyu. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, well, I mean, I think I would probably say in response to this, all of the above, right? At this point, after over 2 decades of enhanced engagement with the Latin American and Caribbean region, we see engagement in really all forms. And this is well articulated and spelled out in China's policies toward the region. The first one was published a number of years ago and most recently in 2016, and also in other policy documents such as that outlined by the China Select Forum, wherein China specifies that a lot of its engagement is indeed economic in nature, but there are political interests, there are security-related interests, especially non-traditional security-related interests, engagement in those areas. And wide-ranging other forms of engagement that China is pursuing at this particular juncture, and which Latin American countries in many cases have also supported. What we've seen over the years, and I'll be quick so that I want to hear Álvaro's perspective on this as well, but what we've seen over the years is a rapid expansion of China's engagement, economic engagement especially, across the entire region, so that almost every country, including those allied with Taiwan, now have some form of economic engagement with China. But what we've seen most recently, and this is really quite important, I think, is something of a tapering in China's overall economic activity. If we're talking about trade, finance, and investment all together. At the same time, a sort of focusing of investment and finance in specific sectors that China deems most important to its own economic growth. And also a localization, which is a really, really critical and interesting development, as I understand, globally, but also in the Latin American and Caribbean region, that is shaping the relationship in new and important ways.
Good. So, Dr. Méndez, do you have anything to add? But also, I want to ask an additional question: is how do these various Latin American countries, how they think about China's growing presence in their region? I think it's very important to understand. I assume there are different opinions, right? Different perspectives. So either you can add something maybe Margaret already said, or you focus on also the how Latin American countries approach China's growing presence in the region.
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you everyone, Jessica, Margaret as well for the invitation, and good to see Margaret as well. And you, thank you for that question. I'm going to start backwards. It's difficult to have one single vision of China because we have 33 countries in the region, 25 of which have diplomatic ties with China. Some of them are closer than the others. But connecting this to what Margaret was saying, enhanced engagement, which I agree with her, this is also a very important historical engagement. This is not new. I mean, it is becoming a very attractive subject. It is sort of the dreamland for any IR theorist, because you can find everything: realism, constructivism, liberalism, cooperation. I mean, you can find everything. But it is important to say also that the relationship goes back to the 1950s, when the Chinese started to reaching out to countries in the global south, the friendship conferences that they were doing. For example, Salvador Allende, when he was a senator, former president of Chile, who was assassinated by Pinochet and partly of the US, he went to China in 1954 to a meeting. So there is a lot of density in that relationship. Cuba, the first country in the entire region to establish diplomatic ties with China in 1960. Then you have a country like Chile, who has, I think now is more than 50 years diplomatic ties with China, to new players. Panama from 2017, which obviously gives the whole thing a geopolitical flavor because of the Panama Canal, in the same way that Panama gave a geopolitical flavor to the US. So there is no consensus, but also what I have noticed, and a little bit when I'm doing research, also China doesn't know how to deal with that, because governments from administration to administration change their views. So I believe that, for example, Beijing had a very good clarity of what they wanted with Panama under President Varela, and the new president arrived and he has gone in a very different direction. So Beijing is sort of trying to see how to adjust to that, and I think that happens in other regions of Latin America. And one thing perhaps to add, I think Jessica mentioned Taiwan, but Taiwan is also a very important element of this triangle. Important to say here that in Central America and one country in South America, out of the 14 countries who have diplomatic ties with Taiwan at the moment, 8 are located in Latin America. This is incredibly, more than 50% out of Taiwan's diplomatic ties are from Latin America. So this also gives this a very important flavor that sometimes is ignored by people who are looking at Taiwan, starting by the fact that Taiwan is in the region.
Okay, good. I think Dr. Méndez put this relationship in a longer historical context. So I want to get back to the contemporary era again, in a sense that contemporary China is economically much stronger, right? So that was very different from in the Mao era, when China was still a much poor developing country. So now, when we talk about China-Latin America relations, there are all kinds of different narratives. One very sort of a widespread narrative is so-called debt trap diplomacy, although originally it's not used to describe China-Latin America relations, but a lot of politicians, media people use this concept. So either of you guys, can you talk a little bit about, is that a myth or reality? What's really going on regarding China's investment in Latin America? Is that all or most debt trap diplomacy, or the reality is more nuanced?
I can respond.
Yes, yeah.
So, at the Inter-American Dialogue, we work with Boston University closely to track China's finance to the region, especially policy bank finance, China Development Bank and Exim Bank finance. And, we found that over the past 6 years now, there's been a rapid decline in policy bank lending to the Latin American and Caribbean region, and with no real lending to Latin America, at least in the past couple of years. And so, in that context, with that context in mind, it's a little bit difficult to say. And certainly, this idea of a debt trap has not doesn't have much traction in the Latin American region among Latin American constituencies, right? Because there is a very clear slowing of overall lending, right? And very little at all over the past couple of years, not just because of the pandemic, but because, there are a number of factors that are limiting China's interest in policy bank interest in particular in engagement with traditional partners.
Mhm.
And so that alone, has been, a major factor sort of shaping the slowing of overall finances has really, I think, in many ways countered, right, this notion of a debt trap. What you do see in Latin America are certainly concerns about the levels of debt that have been incurred, especially among, countries that, including among countries such as Ecuador, Venezuela, others, right, that have been major partners of the policy banks over the past few years. And certainly there are concerns in Ecuador, for example, about paying back Chinese debt. And this was mentioned most recently in the presidential visit that we saw a number of months ago, wherein the two sides sought to develop or plan a meeting in the coming months to talk about negotiation of debt terms. But what we're seeing, there is not just concern about Chinese debt, but about debt levels in general, right, which are not a explicitly Chinese issue. And that is something that the region in general, and some countries in particular, especially are grappling with.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Dr. Méndez, do you have anything to add? I also want to ask a related question is, like China also has this kind of huge BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. So huge sort of infrastructure project, has many diplomatic implications. And also during the pandemic, China has engaged this kind of vaccine diplomacy. So how these Latin American countries, they approach or think about China's these initiatives or diplomatic gestures, including BRI or others. So
sure.
Maybe
Very comprehensive question. Thank you so much, and a very good one. I agree, first of all, with Margaret about the trap debt from the Chinese side. I use your database data set, and of course, that is very useful. And we haven't, as Margaret mentioned, seen an increase on that. I looked at the other side of the spectrum on the financial side. I follow and I track development banks, 2 Chinese development banks who have a very important membership presence in Latin America. First, the AIB, and then the New Development Bank. There are 6 Latin American countries who are members of the AIB. Very modest subscriptions. And right now we have 2 who are members of the New Development Bank or BRICS Bank, that is Brazil and Uruguay, who just became a member a few months ago. So those are very important players now. We have not seen any money really coming in, just $50 million from the AIB to Ecuador in 2020, December 2020. But apart from that, nothing else is happening, but there is excitement. The regional development banks like CAF and the IDB are happy about this because the region needs badly funds for infrastructure. We have one of the worst infrastructures in the entire world, and there is very little investment in infrastructure. So the hope is that these banks will help, not necessarily fund the whole thing, but will be actors like normal entrepreneurs to bring other players into the equation so that there would be additional funding for infrastructure and investment. I will connect this to your question on the BRI, because countries in the region are really keen on the BRI because of what it says about connectivity. So it's a very attractive proposition to the region. The problem is that the BRI is very, very vague. I mean, we see that in Central Asia. I teach a course on the BRI, and one of the answers has been, what is the BRI, professor? I said, well, it is whatever you want it to be. It is extremely vague in a very constructivist manner. And so I think that's a problem. There are 21 countries in the region. I keep track of the ones who have endorsed the BRI. Out of 25 that have diplomatic ties, there are 21 countries that have done so. And to be frank with you, I don't think they really fully understand what the BRI is. One of the policymakers I interviewed recently thought the BRI was the AIB. So I had to explain to him that the AIB was an organization and that the BRI was an initiative. And of course, we haven't seen anything out of the BRI or this particular issue so far. I think it might be coming to a reality. The funding that is coming from the New Development Bank to Brazil is very interesting. Brazil is becoming a very important player in terms of the funding recipients from the New Development Bank. Because of the Russia operations have been put on hold, which is something that has to be highlighted too. The AIB and the NDB put Russia on hold very quickly, very rapidly, which, you know, it strengthens their position as an international development organization, as a multilateral development bank. Then Brazil has taken a better place in the context of the NDB, and with the membership of Uruguay, there are new funds that are being approved at the NDB that might interconnect with Uruguay. We don't know yet, but I think these two players might play an important role in the equation. Plus, the NDB already has co-finance projects with the Regional Development Bank called CAF. I'm extending myself a little bit, so we'll close with the issue of vaccine diplomacy. Yeah, people in Latin America were very happy with it initially. The Global North was not really paying attention to the region. We were ill prepared. So the vaccine diplomacy was well welcomed throughout the region. The problem with it is public opinion thought these vaccines were free. They soon realized that they were not free. And also the efficacy of the vaccines was seen as perhaps not the best vaccine. So in the end, this helped China to gain soft power, but I think it also undermines soft power in the latest stage of the COVID crisis.
Yeah, I completely agree with this ambiguous nature of BRI. There's a saying that people outside of China try to figure out what is BRI. People inside of China try to figure out what is not BRI, because a lot of business sectors, universities in China, they're rallying around this kind of notion of BRI. So it's very ambiguous. Let's get back to the U.S. approach. So given, like, you guys talking about China's presence in Latin America is real, I mean, including all kinds of dimensions. How the United States approach this issue, especially, I want to maybe ask us, start from Margaret, is that what are some of the reasonable concerns? I mean, long-term concern from U.S. perspective, maybe in what aspect, maybe some of U.S. maybe narrative or policies might be overreact or exaggeration. So how you think about like the U.S. approach and also U.S. relationship with Latin America in the context?
Certainly. Yes, I mean, and I think what's really worth pointing out here is that U.S. concerns are often not shared by Latin American nations, right? And so what concerns the U.S., even though it may be a very valid concern from a U.S. perspective, sometimes resonates in the Latin American and Caribbean regions and sometimes does not. And that's something I think the U.S. has struggled with of late as it aims to communicate, you know, concerns and establish something of a shared policy with Latin American partners. But yeah, I mean, areas that I think are legitimate concerns, certainly there is, I mean, and you hear this from U.S. businesses in specific sectors, a lot of competition, right, with Chinese companies now in sectors where U.S. companies, but also European and many other companies, even Latin American companies have been traditionally very active. We're not just talking about, you know, ag and extractives and, you know, transport infrastructure anymore. We're talking about a much wider range of sectors that China is engaged with, including, you know, wide-ranging tech and other industries. So the amount of competition has increased, and the extent to which U.S. companies are still competitive, obviously, and in a lot of parts of the region, the U.S. is still the main investor in the Latin American and Caribbean region as a whole. But the ability to compete with companies when potentially they have privileged access to, low interest finance, or are receiving other incentives for engagement and BRI-related engagement overseas, especially in those sectors that have been prioritized by the Chinese government, is daunting. And it is difficult to compete sometimes. And what the U.S. has found, in this particular sense, is that, what China does is to engage very, very upstream, right? Way before sometimes a project is even in the mind's eye of a city or a town or wherever, Chinese companies and other, representatives are looking to engage. Sometimes with Chinese companies and others even planting the idea, right, for certain types of projects. And U.S. companies and others tend to compete once there is a project bidding process, right, well-defined and underway. And so this is something that, is distinct and continues to, to create challenges for U.S. and other companies. Another area of, of concern, obviously, and we've heard a lot about this, is in the area of technology. And specifically 5G, but not just 5G, right? Technological applications. For example, there was in Chile, a project that the Chilean government wanted to do to document and record all of the records and put them in a centralized database, these personal records of citizens, Chilean citizens. And this was something that China bid for and won, but was opposed by the US, and inevitably Chile gave the contract to somebody else. But there were concerns, obviously, about privacy. And this is at times an issue that, that resonates in the Latin American region. And there are some countries and groups within countries that are concerned about privacy and see eye to eye with the U.S. government on this. And there are others that absolutely do not. But this, continues to be an issue for the U.S. and one where the U.S. government is pushing very hard to ensure that decisions are made vis-a-vis China that do not, in any way negatively impact the U.S. and U.S. data, right? But also privacy and other considerations in these countries themselves. On the same, in the same vein, there is concern about the extent to which Chinese investment in certain types of technologies will affect governance and civil liberties in a region where democracy is rapidly eroding, as it is in many cases globally. And, this has been a concern, especially in Venezuela, where the country has adopted technologies, monitoring technologies, surveillance technologies that very much look like what China is using at home. And here, the concern is that, the Maduro government in particular will be able to monitor the actions of opposition groups and just general citizens to ensure compliance and to, avoid resistance. And so this, is not something that we see all over the region, but certainly is something that, if a country or a government, especially those with more authoritarian inclined tendencies, were interested in these technologies, would be able to access, I think, fairly easily without much thought, I think, on the part of the companies that are selling these technologies at present. So these are all concerns. There are others, of course, too. We talked about the debt issue, which is a big concern and has been articulated many times over by U.S. officials. But in general, I mean, the tech and governance and corruption too are all issues that are addressed, quite frequently by the U.S.
Okay, so Dr. Méndez, how do you think, like Latin American countries, they think about some of these either these U.S. concerns or they think about the U.S.-China competition overall? How these countries, their approach?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to give you my views from Latin. Although I'm in London, I will give you my views as a Latin American, because I think that is very important. I think the U.S. is losing ground to China soft power wise, for two reasons. First, there is the Latin Americans, many countries are still in the honeymoon stage with China. The Chinese don't have that much dirty laundry yet. I think they will eventually have that as much as the US, first of all. And secondly, neglect. Latin America has never been a priority in the US, regardless of what you hear in Washington. It is absolutely the reality. At least is how we feel in Latin America. And I'm talking about right, center, and left. Latin America is only a concern for second-term presidents, meaning if you look at the amount of trips they go to Latin America to, the majority of them are in the second term. Obama, as much as I like him, he went to Cuba, he went to Argentina. If you look at his priority during his first term, you know, it wasn't there. I understand there are political concerns. I think, you know, US presidents are thinking about re-election from the day they arrive in the White House for the first term. So that I understand that. But in general, speaking with officials at the State Department who work in the Western Hemisphere affairs, there is a feeling from them that there is a neglect of Latin America in general. And I think that's problematic. Then, apart from neglect, there is a sense of taking us for granted. I remember speaking with a former Assistant Secretary of Western Hemispheric Affairs in 2014 about what he thought about China's increasing presence in the region. And his answer was really interesting. He told me, I think this is great. This means more money for Latin Americans to spend in the US, which is totally the opposite of what, you know, Margaret was saying. You know, the Chinese are also making Latin America an excellent market for cars, not just security issues, for telephones, televisions, I mean, you name it. Apps, Didi is the competition of Uber. Didi was able to beat Uber in China. Didi now is operating all over Latin America. So there are many other elements that sometimes people don't see. So there is these three variables that I think are important. And there is plenty of evidence to back this up. Bukele, for instance, his predecessor was the one who switched to China. He was nicknamed the Trump of Central America, I believe. Once he got elected, he said, I'm going to revert everything my predecessor did with China because I'm going to be closer to the US. Bukele went to Washington. You know, no one was there for him, no one of real importance. I think he met Trump somewhere, not in a meeting, a state visit. So then he came back to El Salvador and he ended up in Beijing, you know, marching to the songs of arrival presidents. Then Bolsonaro, exactly the same, criticizing China. I think he went far as far as saying that China was the cancer for Latin America. Then focus on the US, tweeting with President Trump, and then not getting a response. He ended up in Beijing again with Xi later on. So there is this sense that there is plenty of evidence for that. Some countries are closer to others than to the US. For example, I mentioned that 21 countries endorsed the BRI out of the 25. These 4 countries that have not endorsed the BRI is because they're closer to the US, I believe. Mexico, Las Bahamas, Brazil, and Colombia. I think that in the case of Mexico and Colombia, I have pretty good evidence to suggest that this is because they're very close to Washington. But the thing is that things can change. The Mexicans, they were not happy about the Summit of the Americas. The Colombians have changed now from, you know, right, center to the left. We don't know what's going to happen next. And of course, things in Brazil could change as well. So I think all of these reasons help us understand that in general, the US could do better. My criticism is constructive. I think the US should listen more to the experts on Latin America and perhaps engage the region a little bit more, because maybe it might be too late in the future. Interestingly, and I finish with this, we were recently approached by the French. I'm not going to tell you which agency, but the government agency, who wanted to us to explore the impact of China in Central America. They are concerned about security issues because they have plenty of territories in Central America and the Caribbean. And of course, they have a very large military contingency in the Caribbean, 3,500 military personnel, civilians and soldiers. So the French are thinking about it. So this means, you know, this is going to be more and more the case in the future. But just to finish, there is also a lot of exaggeration. of what the issues could mean for the U.S. At this stage, I think we don't have the evidence to prove that the Chinese are trying to take over the U.S. or anything like that.
Thank you. I think we have talked a lot about China's influence or impact in Latin America is real, and U.S. have some concerns, but Latin American countries share some concerns, but do not necessarily all agree. So the key is how to manage competition in a prudent way, in a smart way. The United States does not have to see every China-Latin American interaction as a zero-sum game. It's very important to see the issue in a more nuanced way so that we could have a deeper understanding of the issue, and policymakers and public can also understand the relationship in a more nuanced way. So I think that's a good conversation. Thank you. Jessica? Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Álvaro, Margaret, and Xiaoyu for sharing your thoughts and insights with us today. I would also like to thank the National Committee staff members behind the scenes who have made today's interview possible. Special thanks to two of our wonderful interns, Sarah Camacho and Yuquin Tong, for all of their hard work developing today's program. Thanks again and goodbye.